For most of human history, governments were constrained by something very simple. Money was hard to create. Kings could command armies, pass laws, and claim divine authority, but when it came to paying for wars or large projects, they faced an unavoidable limit. Gold and silver had to be mined. Taxes had to be collected openly. Borrowing required willing lenders. If rulers pushed too far, they ran out of money long before they ran out of ambition. This constraint shaped politics more than constitutions ever did. By the early 20th century, that constraint was quietly removed. To understand why 1913 matters, it helps to first understand what money was before that year. Money was not a policy tool. It was a thing. Gold coins, silver coins, banknotes that promised redemption in metal. Governments could debase coins or suspend convertibility temporarily. But these actions were seen as emergencies, scandals, or outright fraud. They carried political consequences. Inflation was not a permanent feature of life. It was an event often associated with collapse or war. In the United States, this restraint was especially strong. The Constitution explicitly limited the government's monetary powers, reflecting deep suspicion towards centralized banking. The country had already lived through two failed central banks in the 19th century, both dismantled after political backlash. For decades, money creation was fragmented among private banks, constrained by gold reserves and periodic panics. The system was unstable, but it was also politically limited. When crises happened, governments could not simply print their way out. This instability is important because it became the justification for a permanent shift in power. In 1907, a severe financial panic swept through the U.S. Banks failed, credit froze, and markets collapsed. There was no central authority to act as lender of last resort. The crisis was eventually contained not by the government, but by private financiers, most notably J.P. Morgan, who coordinated emergency lending to stabilize the system. The optics were terrible. The idea that one private banker could effectively save the national economy alarmed both politicians and the public. Out of this panic came a new narrative. The problem was not excessive leverage or speculative behavior, but the absence of centralized control. The solution, it was argued, was a central bank that could provide liquidity, smooth business cycles, and prevent future crises. This framing was powerful. Stability, expertise, and technocratic management sounded far more appealing than chaotic panics and banker bailouts. In December 1913, while much of the country was distracted by the holiday season, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law shortly after. On paper, the Federal Reserve was a compromise, a decentralized system of regional banks overseen by a central board designed to balance public and private interests. In practice, it marked a fundamental transformation. For the first time, the U.S. government had a permanent institution capable of expanding and contracting the money supply at will. This was not just a financial reform. It was a political revolution. The critical change was not the creation of a central bank itself. Other countries already had them, but the shift in how money was conceptualized. Money was no longer a passive medium of exchange constrained by physical scarcity. It became an instrument of policy. Interest rates, credit conditions, and liquidity can now be adjusted deliberately to achieve political and economic goals. At first, the implications were not fully visible. The dollar was still formally tied to gold. Inflation remained low by historical standards. The Federal Reserve presented itself as a neutral stabilizer, not a power center. But the switch had been flipped. The infrastructure for monetary control was now in place. The timing was not accidental. Just 1 year later, World War I erupted in Europe. The scale of the conflict was unlike anything the world had seen. Industrialized warfare demanded unprecedented levels of spending, weapons, ammunition, logistics, mass mobilization. European governments immediately abandoned gold constraints and turned to borrowing and money creation to fund the war. Inflation surged. Currencies weakened. But the war continued because now it could. When the United States entered the war in 1917, the Federal Reserve played a central role in financing it. The government issued massive amounts of war bonds. The Fed supported these efforts by keeping interest rates low and ensuring banks could absorb the debt. This is a crucial moment. War was no longer funded primarily by taxes imposed in the present, but by promises extracted from the future. The political implications were enormous. Taxation is visible. It requires legislation. It creates resistance. Inflation and debt are quieter. Their costs are delayed, diffuse, and difficult to trace. By enabling large-scale deficit spending without immediate backlash, monetary control fundamentally changed the relationship between governments and citizens. After the war, many countries attempted to return to the old system. Gold convertibility was restored in various forms. Fiscal discipline was preached again, but the world had changed. Governments had learned a lesson they would not forget. Control over money meant freedom from traditional constraints. This lesson became even clearer during the Great Depression. The economic collapse of the 1930s exposed the fragility of the global financial system. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment soared. Trade collapsed. In response, governments did something unprecedented in peacetime. They intervened massively. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took the country off the gold standard domestically in 1933, criminalized private gold ownership, and devalued the dollar. These actions were framed as emergency measures necessary to save the economy, and in the short term, they may have helped stabilize conditions. But politically, they set a precedent. Money was now explicitly subordinated to state objectives. Contracts, savings, and purchasing power could be altered by decree if circumstances demanded it. From this point forward, monetary policy and political power became inseparable. It is important to emphasize that this shift did not occur through tanks in the streets or the suspension of elections. It happened through legislation, expert committees, and crisis management. The language was technical, not ideological. Central banking was presented as neutral, scientific, and apolitical. That presentation is precisely what made it so powerful. By the mid-20th century, most citizens no longer thought of money as something that constrained the state. Instead, they saw it as something the state managed on their behalf. Inflation was accepted as normal. Business cycles were seen as technical problems to be fine-tuned. The idea that money could be used to shape behavior, encouraging borrowing, discouraging saving, steering investment became standard policy. The crucial insight governments gained between 1913 and the 1930s was simple. Controlling money was often more effective than controlling people directly. You did not need soldiers to enforce austerity if inflation quietly reduced real wages. You did not need explicit rationing if credit conditions shaped consumption. You did not need overt repression if economic dependence ensured compliance. The day money became political was not marked by a single speech or declaration. It was a gradual realization, emerging from crisis after crisis, that monetary control offered something armies could not: influence without force, obedience without coercion, power without visibility. By the time the world emerged from World War II, this realization would be fully embedded in the global system. But the foundation had already been laid decades earlier, when the constraint of hard money gave way to the flexibility and temptation of managed currency. When governments discovered that money could be created rather than earned, war stopped being limited by consent and started being limited only by credibility. The First World War was the experiment that proved this new reality beyond any doubt. Before 1914, even the most powerful empires understood that war had a clear financial ceiling. Armies could march only as long as treasuries could pay. Taxes could be raised, but only to a point. Borrowing was possible, but lenders demanded discipline. Once gold reserves ran low, the war effort slowed or stopped. That logic collapsed almost overnight. As soon as the war began, major European powers suspended gold convertibility. Britain, Germany, France, and others effectively abandoned the idea that money represented a fixed claim on metal. Instead, money became a claim on the future output of society. Governments issued bonds at an unprecedented scale, and central banks ensured that banks had the liquidity to absorb them. The public was told these were temporary measures, patriotic necessities. Few understood that a permanent transformation was underway. Germany provides one of the clearest early examples. Cut off from international capital markets by the British naval blockade, the German government financed most of the war internally, rather than raise taxes sharply. It relied heavily on borrowing, with the expectation that victory would allow reparations to cover the debt. The Reichsbank accommodated this strategy by expanding credit. Prices rose steadily throughout the war, even before the famous hyperinflation of the 1920s. The cost of war was not paid in real time. It was deferred. Britain followed a similar path, though with greater access to global finance. The Bank of England supported massive government borrowing, while the pound's link to gold became increasingly symbolic. The United States, entering the war later, used the newly created Federal Reserve to coordinate war finance. Interest rates were kept artificially low to make government bonds attractive and affordable. The message was clear: monetary policy would spur the war effort. This was not merely a technical adjustment. It changed the political economy of war itself. In previous centuries, wars often ended when taxpayers revolted or treasuries emptied. In the 20th century, wars could continue as long as central banks maintained confidence and inflation remained politically tolerable. The constraint shifted from resources to psychology. After the war ended in 1918, the bill came due. Europe was buried under debt. Currencies were weakened. Social tensions exploded. Governments attempted to restore pre-war monetary order by returning to the gold standard, believing that discipline could be reimposed. This attempt failed repeatedly. The world had experienced what unconstrained money could do, and going back proved far harder than leaving in the first place. The interwar period became a struggle between old monetary rules and new political realities. Britain returned to gold in 1925 at an overvalued exchange rate, sacrificing employment and industrial competitiveness in the name of credibility. Germany, crushed by reparations and internal debt, slid into hyperinflation in 1923, wiping out the middle class's savings and destabilizing the political system. These were not accidents. They were the consequences of trying to force a pre-war monetary framework onto a post-war debt structure. What mattered politically was not just inflation or deflation, but the lesson learned by governments. They saw that monetary collapse destroyed regimes, but they also saw that monetary flexibility had allowed them to survive war. The challenge was to find a middle path, enough control to fund the state, enough stability to preserve legitimacy. The Second World War completed this learning process. By 1939, no major power seriously believed that a war survival could be fought under gold constraints. This time, monetary coordination was deliberate and systematic. In the United States, the Federal Reserve explicitly capped interest rates on government debt. Treasury bills were pegged at low yields, and the Fed stood ready to buy unlimited quantities to enforce the peg. This ensured that the cost of borrowing remained manageable regardless of the scale of spending. The numbers were staggering. U.S. federal debt rose from roughly 40% of GDP in 1939 to over 120% by 1946. Taxes increased, but they covered only part of the cost. The rest was financed through borrowing supported by monetary expansion. Inflation was contained not by sound money, but by price controls, rationing, and financial repression. Citizens were compelled to save through war bonds while their alternatives were restricted. This model proved devastatingly effective. The United States outproduced its enemies, supplied its allies, and emerged from the war as the dominant global power. The lesson was unmistakable. With full control over money and credit, a government could mobilize an entire society for total war without triggering immediate financial collapse. Other countries learned the same lesson, even when the outcomes were catastrophic. Nazi Germany financed its early rearmament through off-balance sheet credit instruments like Mefo bills, effectively creating money without formal budget approval. Japan relied on central bank financing to support its imperial expansion. In each case, monetary manipulation enabled political ambition far beyond what traditional taxation would have allowed. By the time the war ended, the relationship between money and power had been permanently altered. The question was no longer whether governments should control money, But how to manage that control without destroying the system? This question led directly to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. Bretton Woods was presented as a return to order. Currencies would be pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar would be convertible into gold at a fixed price. New institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created to stabilize the global system. But this was not a restoration of the old gold standard. It was a managed system, with the United States at its center and monetary policy subordinated to geopolitical goals. Under Bretton Woods, the United States gained an extraordinary privilege. Because the dollar served as the world's reserve currency, the U.S. could finance deficits by issuing liabilities that other countries willingly held. This was war financed by other means. Military bases, foreign interventions, and global influence could be sustained without the same constraints faced by earlier empires. The system worked as long as confidence held. By the late 1960s, however, cracks began to show. The cost of the Vietnam War and expansive domestic programs strained the system. Dollars accumulated overseas, while U.S. gold reserves remained finite. Foreign governments, notably France, began demanding gold in exchange for dollars, testing the system's limits. In 1971, President Richard Nixon closed a gold window, ending dollar convertibility permanently. This act is often described as a technical adjustment. In reality, it was a final confirmation of a century-long transformation. Money was no longer anchored to anything outside political authority. From that point on, debt replaced taxation as the primary tool of state finance, and monetary policy became the silent partner of political power. Wars no longer required explicit sacrifice from the population in the present. Their costs could be spread across decades through inflation and debt monetization. What the 20th century proved, through 2 world wars and their aftermath, was that money had become the perfect incentive structure for power. It allowed governments to promise everything now and pay later. It enabled political projects that would have been impossible under hard constraints. And most importantly, it taught states that control over money was not just an economic advantage, but a strategic one. By mastering debt and monetary expansion, governments had found a way to wage war, expand influence, and reshape society without relying solely on force. The battlefield had moved. It now ran through balance sheets, bond market, and central bank decisions. After the Second World War, something subtle but profound happened. Governments no longer needed war as the excuse to control money. The machinery built for emergency became the machinery of everyday governance. Central banks stayed powerful, deficit spending became normal, and inflation stopped being viewed as a failure. It was reframed as a management problem. From this point forward, monetary policy was no longer about survival. It was about shaping behavior. This is where money fully replaced force. In the decades immediately following the war, many Western countries expanded what came to be known as the welfare state. Pensions, unemployment insurance, public health care, housing programs, and large infrastructure projects all required sustained government spending. Funding these programs entirely through taxation would have been politically explosive. Voters resist visible costs. Raising taxes is an admission of limits. Debt, by contrast, feels painless. Inflation is even quieter. Central banks made this possible. By keeping interest rates low and providing a ready market for government bonds, they allowed states to run persistent deficits without immediate consequences. The public was told this was responsible management, smoothing the business cycle, maintaining full employment, avoiding social unrest. And for a time, it seemed to work. But the real shift was psychological. Money was no longer something people saved first and spent later. It became something you borrowed now and worried about later. Policy reinforced this behavior deliberately. Low interest rates rewarded debtors and punished savers. Inflation slowly eroded cash holdings. Over time, the rational citizen became not the frugal one, but the leveraged one. This was not an accident. Inflation functions as a tax that requires no vote. Unlike income taxes or sales taxes, It does not appear on a pay stub or receipt. Its effects are diffused across time and population. When prices rise faster than wages, purchasing power is quietly transferred from households to debtors, including governments. The more debt a state carries, the more it benefits from inflation. What would be politically unacceptable as an explicit policy becomes tolerable as a side effect. The 1970s made this dynamic impossible to ignore. Following decades of monetary expansion and fiscal deficits, inflation surged across the developed world. In the United States, consumer prices rose at double-digit rates. Energy shocks and geopolitical turmoil played a role, but the underlying cause was structural: too much money chasing too few goods. The response was telling. Rather than questioning the political use of money, governments treated inflation as a technical problem to be fine-tuned by experts. When President Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold in 1971, he removed the final external constraint on monetary power. From that moment on, money was whatever governments and central banks said it was. There was no anchor, only policy. Inflation was no longer a breakdown of the system. It was part of the system. The famous Volcker shock of the early 1980s, when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively to crush inflation, is often cited as proof that central banks can restore discipline. What is less discussed is the political context. Inflation had become socially destabilizing. It threatened legitimacy. Crushing it required recession, mass unemployment, and immense pain. Only an independent central bank could impose such costs without direct political accountability. This independence, however, was always conditional. Central banks were free to act as long as they served the broader interests of the state. Once inflation was subdued and growth resumed, the long-term trend returned: falling interest rates, rising debt, expanding balance sheets. Monetary restraint was episodic. Monetary accommodation was permanent. By the 1990s and early 2000s, a new model had solidified. Governments outsourced economic stabilization to central banks, while central banks used monetary policy to support asset markets and financial institutions. Crises were no longer allowed to fully resolve. Instead, they were managed. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the true extent of this shift. When the global banking system teetered on collapse, governments and central banks intervened on a scale previously associated only with wartime. Trillions of dollars were created to stabilize banks, guarantee liabilities, and support markets. Interest rates were pushed to zero. Central bank balance sheets exploded. Once again, the justification was emergency. But as before, the emergency never fully ended. Quantitative easing was described as temporary. Zero interest rates were described as exceptional. Yet year after year, these policies persisted. The result was not just economic distortion, but social transformation. Asset prices soared. Wages lagged. Those who owned financial assets benefited enormously. Those who relied on labor income fell behind. This outcome was not politically neutral. By inflating asset values, monetary policy reshaped class structure. Wealth concentrated among those closest to the financial system. Young people were pushed into debt to access housing and education. Saving in cash became irrational. Dependence on credit became normal. Control no longer required commands. It operated through incentives. Consider how behavior changed. When interest rates are low, people are encouraged to spend rather than save. When inflation is expected, holding cash feels irresponsible. When asset prices are supported, risk-taking is rewarded. Over time, these signals guide millions of individual decisions. No law forces people to borrow. No police enforce consumption. Yet the aggregate outcome aligns with policy goals. This is the power of monetary control. It extends beyond economics into politics itself. Governments running large deficits are less constrained by voter resistance when borrowing costs are low. Central banks, by stabilizing bond markets, indirectly stabilize political regimes. Financial repression, keeping rates below inflation, allows states to reduce real debt burdens without default. The cost is borne by savers, pensioners, and wage earners, often without clear attribution. In authoritarian systems, control is visible, censorship force, surveillance. In modern monetary systems, control is subtle. It operates through balance sheets and expectations. People feel economic pressure, but struggle to identify its source. Anger is diffused. Responsibility is obscured. This is why inflation is so politically useful. It erodes purchasing power gradually, unevenly, and without a single moment of confrontation. It can fund wars, welfare states, bailouts, and political promises without the immediate backlash that taxation provokes. It allows governments to appear generous while remaining solvent. By the early 21st century, most citizens had grown up knowing nothing else. Permanent inflation, permanent debt, and permanent monetary management were simply the background conditions of life. The idea that money might constrain political power felt archaic. And that was the point. Money had become the most effective tool of social control, not because it was oppressive, but because it was invisible. It shaped choices without issuing orders. It redistributed resources without debate. It aligned individual survival with systemic dependence. The battlefield was no longer the street or the parliament. It was the purchasing power of a paycheck, the interest rate on a mortgage, the value of a pension. Control did not require force. It required policy. By mastering inflation and credit, governments had learned how to govern behavior itself. And in doing so, they had moved further away from the need to rule through fear and closer to the ability to rule through money. By the time the world entered the 21st century, the transformation was complete. Money was no longer just political. It was structural. Entire societies now rested on assumptions that only made sense if monetary control remained uninterrupted. Debt levels that would once have triggered default or revolution became normal. Asset prices detached from productive output. Government spoke less about budgets and more about financial conditions. The center of gravity had shifted permanently. The 2008 financial crisis was the moment this reality became impossible to deny. When the global banking system began to collapse, the response was immediate and revealing. Central banks did not hesitate. They created money on a scale that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and others expanded their balance sheets by trillions. Banks were rescued. Markets were stabilized. Governments were spared the political cost of letting the system fail. This was not simply economic intervention. It was political triage. Allowing major financial institutions to collapse would have meant mass unemployment, wiped out savings, and social unrest. But more importantly, it would have meant admitting that the system built on debt and monetary management was fragile. Instead, the solution was to deepen the system. More liquidity, lower rates, greater dependence. The justification was necessity. The consequence was permanence. From that point on, central banks became the de facto shock absorbers of the political order. Whenever markets trembled, they stepped in. Whenever governments faced fiscal stress, borrowing costs were contained. The line between monetary policy and political survival blurred beyond recognition. This dynamic intensified during the COVID-19 crisis. Lockdowns froze economic activity. Governments promised income support, business loans, healthcare spending, and emergency programs on a massive scale. Once again, central banks ensured that financing was not a constraint. Money creation accelerated faster than at any point in peacetime history. What would once have required explicit wartime mobilization happened through spreadsheets and press conferences. The result was predictable. Asset prices surged. Inflation returned. Supply chains strained. Yet despite rising prices and declining purchasing power, governments continued to spend. The political logic was clear. In a system where money can be created, restraint is optional. Delay is dangerous. Action, even if inflationary, is safer than inaction. This reveals a final lesson governments learned over the past century. Controlling money means controlling time. Debt allows costs to be shifted forward. Inflation allows costs to be blurred. Monetary intervention allows crises to be postponed. Each tool reduces the need for immediate political consensus. Each weakens a feedback loop between policy decisions and public resistance. This is why modern power no longer looks like dictatorship. It looks like management. Central banks are formally independent, yet their actions consistently align with the needs of the state. When debt levels rise, rates stay low. When markets panic, liquidity appears. When inequality worsens, asset support continues. The language is technical, but the outcomes are political. Those closest to the monetary system benefit first. Governments gain flexibility. Financial institutions gain protection. Asset holders gain appreciation. Those further away wage earners, savers, young people absorb the adjustment through higher living costs and deeper dependence on credit. This distribution is not voted on. It emerges. As a result, political conflict shifts away from money itself and towards symptoms. Voters argue about wages, housing, healthcare, and inequality, rarely tracing these problems back to the monetary structure that shapes them. Money becomes the invisible background condition of all debates, never the subject. This invisibility is power. Historically, control required enforcement. Armies enforce borders. Police enforce laws. Violence enforce compliance. But monetary control operates upstream. It shapes the environment in which choices are made. When survival depends on access to credit, people self-discipline. When inflation punishes cash, people conform to the system. When asset inflation determines social mobility, participation becomes mandatory. No soldier needs to knock on the door. This does not mean modern states are omnipotent. Monetary power has limits. Inflation can destabilize regimes. Loss of confidence can trigger collapse. But within those limits, control over money offers a degree of influence unmatched by traditional force. This is why challenges to monetary authority are treated as existential threats. Hyperinflation destroys legitimacy. Currency substitution undermines sovereignty. Parallel systems weaken control. Throughout history, states have reacted aggressively to anything that threatens their monopoly over money, because that monopoly underpins all others. From 1913 onward, the trajectory is clear. Governments move from taxing openly to borrowing quietly, from borrowing cautiously to monetizing freely, from using money as a medium to using it as a mechanism of governance. At each stage, the same promise was made: stability, growth, protection. And at each stage, dependence deepened. Today, when governments speak of economic policy, they rarely mention limits. They speak of tools, levers, and frameworks. They assume central banks will act. They assume markets will comply. They assume the future can absorb the cost. But this assumption rests on a single condition: that people continue to believe in the money they use. Money, after all, is not wealth. It is trust institutionalized. And trust, once politicized, becomes fragile. The paradox of modern power is that it relies less on fear and more on belief. Belief that inflation will be temporary. Belief that debt will be manageable. Belief that experts are in control. As long as that belief holds, the system functions. When it cracks, the consequences are swift. This is why the control of money ultimately surpasses the control of armies. Armies can seize territory, but money shapes behavior everywhere at once. Armies provoke resistance, but monetary pressure often goes unrecognized. Armies require constant force, but monetary systems operate continuously, automatically, impersonally. The day money became political was the day power learned to hide. From the creation of central banks, to the financing of world wars, to the normalization of inflation and debt, a single pattern emerges. Whoever controls money controls incentives. Whoever controls incentives controls choices. And whoever controls choices controls society. Not through orders, not through violence, but through the quiet architecture of money itself.